Marine Lieutenant General Holland, M. Holland's 5th Amphibious Corps in the summer of 1944. The next target of Howlin' Mad Smith was the Japanese-occupied island of Saipan in the Mariana Islands, which is one of the Islands of Mystery. "This one isn't going to be easy," said Assistant Division Commander, 2nd Marine Division Brig. General Merritt A. Edson, and Smith agreed. "We have now finished the flat atolls. We have mastered the art of crushing atolls, but now we face mountains and caverns where the Japanese can bury themselves. Marines will be dead in large numbers in a week." Operation Tearaway, the name given to the island's conquest, would solidify American soldiers inside Japan's inner defense zone. Smith claimed that in order to initiate very long-range air attacks on Japan, the U.S. required air bases. The Japanese Central Pacific Fleet Headquarters Commander, Vice Adm. Chuichi Nagumo, agreed. "The home island's first line of defense is the Marianas," he stated. Nagumo, who would kill himself on Saipan on July 6, 1944, had spearheaded the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. With the Army's 27th Infantry Division, 27th ID, led by Major General Ralph C. Smith, in reserve, General Smith's force, known as the Northern Attack Force, Task Force 52, would consist of 2 veteran Marine divisions, the 2nd Mayor Div, commanded by Major General Thomas E. Watson, and the 4th Mayor Div, commanded by Major General Harry Schmidt. The 5th Amphibious Corps has 71,000 Marines and soldiers in total. An estimated 3,000 Japanese, including 5,000 sailors from the 5th Special Base Force, 1st Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force, also known as Japanese Marines, the 55th Naval Guard Force, and the 9th Tank Regiment, which consisted of 4 companies with 12 Type 95 Heigo light tanks and 35 Type 97 Kai Shinhoto Chiha medium tanks, supported the 1st Expeditionary Force in defending Saipan. "It was the Marianas' most heavily garrisoned island," said General Smith. The Japanese strategy of destroying the enemy at the beaches during the force buildup, when the invading force was most exposed and before they could establish a footing ashore, served as the foundation for the island's defense. An intercepted Japanese document said, "A policy of tactical command based on aggressiveness, determination, and initiative is expected to destroy the enemy on the beaches." The battle order said, 7 lives to repay our country." This meant that every Japanese soldier vowed to kill 7 Americans before he died. The Japanese forces were headed by Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. His 2 main units were the 47th Independent Mixed Brigade, led by Colonel Yoshiro Oka, and consisting of 3 separate infantry battalions, 316th, 317th, and 318th, and the 43rd Division, reinforced, which was made up of 3 infantry regiments, 118th, 135th, less 1st Battalion, and the 136th, along with supplementary units for transportation, medicine, ordnance, and communication. The Japanese modified their naming system in May 1944. Infantry soldiers were numbered sequentially and arranged into independent infantry battalions. After that, the battalions joined independent mixed brigades, which included an engineering company, an anti-aircraft unit, or 1 or more artillery battalions. Numbers were then allocated to these brigades. The Japanese separated Saipan into 4 defense sectors: the Navy Sector, 5th Special Base Force; the Central Sector, 136th Infantry Regiment; the Southern Sector, 47th Independent Mixed Brigade; and the Northern Sector, 135th Infantry Regiment, which covered the northern portion of the island. Other units were situated at Muet Fina Susu, 1 Battalion of Field Artillery, Chachalaulau Area, 9th Tank Regiment, Aslido Airfield, Anti-Aircraft Artillery, and Chacha-Tsutsuran Area, 4 infantry companies in reserve. Starting on D-4, Vice Adm. Mark A. Mitcher's Task Force, 58, 55 ships, 11 battleships, 5 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 24 LCI gunboats, LCI-G, limited the preparatory bombardment for Saipan to carrier and surface strikes. Artillery weapons, anti-aircraft batteries, coast defense guns, and other enemy fortifications and people were their main targets. The landing beaches, known and suspected enemy coast defense gun positions, and anti-aircraft and field artillery batteries were all targeted by naval fire at dawn on D-Day, June 15, 1944. I was eating a big rice ball when I heard a voice shout, "The American battle fleet is here," said squad leader Yamauchi Takeo, an NCO in the 43rd Division. I noticed that the sea was entirely black with them when I looked up. Then came the naval barrage. Things shot 60 meters straight up as the first salvo detonated along the shore. The region was pocked like the moon's craters. We were half buried, clinging to the ground in our small holes. I was blinded by the soil that filled my mouth. You nearly choked on the flying dirt and smells. I might acquire it the next moment. Although there had been sporadic bombing for several months, concentrated aircraft bombardment had started 2 days prior to the landing. In order to destroy enemy aircraft and provide counter-battery fire to Japanese artillery, firing on American minesweepers, fast carrier force planes conducted fighter sweeps over Aslido Airport on D-2. Yamauchi said, "Anti-aircraft artillery suddenly started to blast away." I raised my head. The air attack began as a large number of American jets appeared directly in front of me. Inland shore defense and anti-aircraft guns were intensively bombed on D-1. Fields of cane that had not yet been burned were to be burned. Inland defense posts and structures, the buildings surrounding Aslido Airstrip, and the communications and transportation infrastructure on Saipan's west coast, including small boats, radio stations, observation towers, railroad and road intersections, and automobiles, were also top targets. Underwater demolition crews working near offshore were to be protected by 6 smoke jets if needed. I was awakened by the air raid alarm and immediately led all men into the trench, wrote a Japanese NCO in his recovered journal. Numerous enemy Grumman aircraft started bombing and strafing the Aslido airstrip. Amid the erroneous anti-aircraft fire, the enemy planes went loose for approximately 2 hours before finally departing slowly. We were powerless to do anything but observe. On D-Day, the Japanese fortifications were subjected to a meticulously planned barrage of air and naval fire. The gunfire ships began to open up around 5:30 a.m., focusing on enemy positions that might obstruct the landing and the landing beaches. "The din robbed us totally of all sense of hearing," recalled a Japanese soldier of the bombing. "It was more like to being imprisoned inside a massive metal drum that was relentlessly and unbearably pounded with 1,000 iron hammers than it was to hearing a boom or roar that divides the ear. Very intense flashes and boiling clouds of smoke. The area I was in was pitted like the craters of the moon," said another soldier. "We were just half buried, clinging to the ground in our small holes. The towns of Garapan and Charankanoa lay in smoking ruins, and the big sugar mill north of Charankanoa loomed like a giant blackened skeleton against the pink summer sky," wrote the author of the 4th Marine Division during World War II. Many of us watching the shells explode in the dark all over Saipan thought that nothing could survive that pounding, so we felt relief that our job going in would be easy, remembered Richard G. Peterson, a member of Company D, 2nd Amtrak Battalion. However, the Marines who had spent November the 20-23, 1943 on Tarawa were far more knowledgeable. In order to give carrier planes time to bomb and strafe, the ships stopped firing for 30 minutes at 7 a.m. In an attempt to stop the enemy from firing on the landing craft, 24 LCI gunboats with 20mm and 40mm guns and rockets moved in to pepper the beaches just before the planned landing. Naval gunfire support was a decisive factor in the conduct of operations, wrote Lieutenant General Smith in his final report on the operation. There can be little doubt that naval gunfire is the most feared and most effective of all weapons, with which the Japanese are confronted in resisting a landing and assault, wrote Rear Adm. Harry W. Hill, commander of the Western Landing Group. POWs consistently said that naval gunfire was the most crucial element in achieving their defeat. General Smith had a change of heart a few years later. An enemy of the strength we found on Saipan could not be neutralized by 3.5 days of air and surface bombardment. The Marines' complaints about the Navy's lack of gunfire support would not be the last. After requesting 10 days of preliminary bombardment, Iwo Jimawa's only provided 3 days. Operation Tearaway's plan of action planned for the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions to make an amphibious landing on June 15, 1944, on beaches next to the sugar refinery village of Charan Kanoa and on both sides of Afetna Point. They were to land abreast over the western reef, the 2nd Mardiv on the left, green and red beaches, and the 4th Mardiv on the right, blue and yellow beaches. The 4th Mardiv was to strike to the southeast and take control of Aslido Airport, while the 2nd Mardiv was to advance northeast and take Montepochau. The attack was to proceed with the 2 divisions abreast to the north and northeast to secure the remaining portion of Saipan after the force beachhead line had been secured. The landing plan called for 8 battalion landing teams to cross a 250, 700-yard reef at the same time. On 7 of Saipan's 11 authorized landing beaches, red 1, 2, and 3, green 1, 2, and 3, blue 1 and 2, and yellow 1, 2, and 3, 8,000 men were anticipated to land abreast within the first 20 minutes, covering a front of 6,000 yards. Marines from the 1st Battalion, 29th Marines, and the 2nd Regimental Combat Team performed a diversionary display off the beaches northwest of Tanapag Harbor from 30 minutes before sunrise until an hour after the main invasion. After circling for 10 minutes, their landing craft traveled as far as 5,000 yards off the beach before heading back to their transports. Our landing was the most advanced mechanical demonstration we had ever made in the Pacific, Howland Mad Smith remarked. Troop-carrying tractors, LVT, tanks equipped with 75mm howitzers and 37mm guns, LVT-A4, and the new LVT-4s, a kind featuring a backdropping ramp that dropped our weaponry immediately ashore, were among our 800 amphibious vehicles. Originally scheduled for 8:30 a.m., H-hour was moved back by 10 minutes to provide the boat waves more time to position themselves. Vice Admiral Richard K. at 5:42 a.m. The venerable directive, land the landing force, was sent to the 34-ship landing ship tanks, LST Flotilla, which was 1,250 yards behind the line of departure, by Terrible Turner, Commander, Northern Attack Force. According to Marine Marshal E. Harris, the bow doors opened. While waiting for the signal from the Navy control boats, hundreds of armored amphibian tanks, also called Amtanks by the crews, and amphibian tractors, also called Amtracks, crawled into the water and began to circle. Suddenly we faced Saipan, then clattered down the LST's metal ramp toward the sea. Our job was to lead the first wave onto green and red beaches, clearing the enemy off those beaches and then pushing 200 yards inland so Marine infantry coming behind us could cross the beaches intact. The signal was given at 8:13 a.m., and 96 amphibious tractors, LVTs, carrying the assault units of the 2nd and 4th Divisions, began their journey to the landing beaches, according to Robert E. Wallen, who was riding in an armored amphibian. LCMs, landing craft, mechanized, carrying light and medium tanks from the 2nd and 4th Tank Battalions, were launched from 2 landing ship docks, LSDs, at 7:40 a.m. The LCMs arrived at their designated places at the back of each division's beach without incident. The tanks were in a on-call wave, which meant that the commander of the supported unit might order them to land. In order to ferry laden landing craft, ballast down to their well decks, drop the stern gate to the sea, and discharge their vehicles and craft for the attack on a hostile beach, the LSDs were built in an unusual way. On the lower west coast of Saipan, the landing beaches of the 2nd Mardiv, Green 1 and 2, 8th Marines Regimental Combat Team, and Red 1 and 2, 6th Marines Regimental Combat Team, were next to the landing beaches of the 4th Mardiv, which were color-coded Blue 1 and Blue 2, 23rd Marines Regimental Combat Team, and Yellow 1 and Yellow 2, a 25th Marines Regimental Combat Team. 68 armored amphibians, arranged in line abreast and equipped with 37mm and 75mm cannons, made up the initial wave. 4 waves of 196 troop-carrying amphibious tractors, separated by 2 to 6 minutes, came up behind them. In fine order, the first wave came up to the reef's edge. I waited for a wave to lift us up onto the coral, then I shifted as we rode the wave and got across and off it quite well, said Charles H. Orlowski, who was operating one of the amphibian tanks. We got no Japanese fire outside the reef, Robert E. Wallen recalled. Little colored flags protruded from the sea as I passed over the reef. While they waited for us to approach, the Japanese drove in aiming stakes for their guns overnight. Then everything went haywire. Artillery fire, small arms fire, and mortar fire all grew more intense. It was impossible to shoot our 75mm howitzer with accuracy in the lagoon, hitting coral heads, bouncing us up, down, and sideways, remembered Jerry D. Brooks. Just in front of us, 2 of our 75mm shells detonated. 2 or 3 went almost vertical, but the adversary obviously took notice of our noise and our presence alone. Tokyo was informed by naval operators keeping an eye on Japanese radio communications that monster guns, affixed to monster floating tanks, were approaching them in the front waves of the assault. The muzzle of our 75mm with blast shield resembled that of an 8-inch gun. Winton W. Carter recalled, I saw a watery explosion near the beach, then another and another. 2 males stood up and began to sprint inland ahead, just to my left. I gazed, immobilized. I made an effort to understand this. They wore short-sleeved shirts and steel helmets. You lummox, the enemy, shoot! They're Japanese! It felt like forever. However, it probably took 2 or 3 seconds for my hands and head to start cooperating. After that, I fired my machine gun and opened fire. Jap artillery was still bracketing us, trying to get our range, and drenching us with near misses, splashing water into open turret hatches. Wallen, in his armored amphibian, recalled, they were still misses. We were fortunate. The assault wave approaching from behind us appeared to be struggling as the Japanese drew closer. Saipan immediately turned into a brutal battle of annihilation, led by armored amphibian tractors. The Marines hit the beach at 0843. The best we could do was get a toehold and hang on, said General Smith. Just wait for the first crucial day, and that's what we did. I saw out the side hatch an AM tank afire next to us. Its hatch going up and down, Neil Mumford said, as he recalled reaching the land. I believed someone was attempting to escape, but the heat was causing the hatch to flap, and then the ammunition in the tank started to explode. Our turret's foundation was struck by a shell. After abandoning our tank, we found that it was safer inside. Squad leader Yamauchi Takeo observed the leading waves of soldiers land and disembark, falling short of the first day's goal, the 01 line. Someone yelled, "The American army is on its way," Yamauchi remarked. I raised my head slightly. Like a swarm of grasshoppers, they moved forward. The American soldiers were so small when they waded ashore, completely soaking. I witnessed flames rising from Japanese-fired American tanks. The Marines were pinned to a shallow beachhead by the long-range grazing fire of Japanese machine guns from a Fetna and a Jingen points that bombarded the beaches. We were surrounded by the disorderly wreckage of a bloody battle, as First Lieutenant John C. Chapin remembered. The burnt-out pillboxes, the charred remains of LVTs that had been knocked out by Jap high-velocity fire, the mangled and hideous bodies of Marines and Japanese, the shattered trees, the churned-up sand covered in abandoned equipment, the sharp stench of high explosives, and then, wham! A shell struck us directly. Unconsciously, we all hit the deck and started to spread out, but I was too shocked to believe it. Then the shells really started to fall on us, in front of us, behind us, on each side, and right in the middle. They would thunder down with the noise of a freight train and then burst into an unfathomable, deafening apocalypse. The assault companies were engaged in a battle for every available inch. At one point, Holland Smith stated, "Our beachhead was only a dozen yards deep. Our attention was concentrated on our yard-by-yard advance inland." It's difficult to dig a hole when you're lying on your stomach using your chin, elbows, knees, and toes. But I discovered that it is possible to do so, remembered another officer. For the first 20 minutes, an artillery or mortar shell landed every 3 seconds, according to journalist Robert Sherrod. Some of them reached the beach itself, but the majority were in the ocean, at least 100 yards offshore, inside the 7-foot-deep tank trap that the Japanese had constructed for their defense and that we were now employing for our own defense. None of them were struck. The battalion aid station for 2-8, Lieutenant Colonel H.P. Crow, was established inside the trap. I counted 17 dead Marines in the 300 yards between 2 wrecked vehicles, and there were 6 troops lying on the beach, already covered in bloody bandages, waiting to be evacuated by Amtraks. A young, fair-haired private who had just arrived as a replacement, full of exuberance at finally being a full-fledged Marine on the battlefront, Captain John A. Magruder observed. I will never forget what I saw as I gazed down at his body. A yellow pocket edition of a book that he had clearly been reading in his free time protruded from the pocket of his back pant. All that could be seen was the title, Our Hearts Were Young and Gay. Over 2,000 men were killed and 1022 wounded during the landing. 553 men were killed and 1022 wounded in the 2nd Division alone. 31 of the 68 armored amphibians were crippled or sunk. On D-Day, 5 of the 2 division's original infantry unit commanders suffered injuries. Howlin' Mad stated, "We couldn't claim to have secured our beachhead for another 3 days. We were constantly under a lot of pressure." Tank support was sought just before noon, with the Canadian Ronson flame cannon mounted on 18 M3A1 Satan flamethrower tanks and 46 recently acquired M4A2 Sherman medium tanks. Major Richard K. Schmidt's 4th Tank Battalion was assigned to support the 4th Mardiv's assault battalions. Regimental Combat Team 25, RCT 25, included Company A, under the command of 1st Lieutenant Stephen Horton, Jr., and Company D's 1st Platoon. A strong northerly current caused the company to land on Blue Beach 2, even though the operating plan called for the company to land over Yellow Beach 2. Company B was assigned to the Battalion Landing Team, BLT 3-23, and was supposed to land over Blue Beach 1. It was commanded by 1st Lieutenant Roger F. C. Schultz. Major Robert M. Nyman commanded Company C, which was assigned to BLT 223, 4th Mardev, and was supposed to land over Blue Beach 2. Throughout the day, Company D, Captain Gorman T. Webb's Satans, landed over Blue Beach with the mission of supporting RCT 23. After landing at midday, headquarters and service company started salvage efforts right away. Major Schmidt, the son of the commander of 4th Mardiv, continued to serve as a liaison officer and counselor on tank employment on board the division command ship. The 4th Tank Battalion had 2 ways to go ashore, according to the underwater demolition team's reports. The first and most preferred route was via the channel off Blue Beach 1, which allowed LCMs to go straight to the shore. The alternative was to have the tanks move ashore on their own and beach the LCMs on the reef. As it happened, neither choice was adequate. Heavy mortar and artillery fire was sporadically falling on the waterway. By early afternoon, it was hard to beach the LCMs due to strong surf. Therefore, the reef alternative presented a challenge. The coral shelf off Yellow Beach 2 turned out to be the ideal landing spot, despite the fact that all tanks landed under intense mortar and artillery fire. Due to a lack of coordination and communication, the planned strategy of using LVTs to guide tanks to the beach did not work. With the exception of the heavy gunfire, which presented a serious risk, the alternative strategy, foot guides, was employed and was largely successful. Major Neiman had a new method for finding craters and potholes that were underwater. We discovered a solution, which we termed toilet paper. We took 2 tankers and, while swimming face down in front of each tank, we placed a man in the water wearing swim fins, goggles, and a roll of toilet paper. To provide the driver with hand signals via his periscope, we placed a second guy on the slope plate of each tank. When the guy swimming encountered a pothole, which they did from time to time, they would just swim around it while uncoiling the toilet paper. The toilet paper would simply offer the ideal route around the pothole because the water over the reef was so smooth. PFC, one of the volunteers, for offering to lead his tank from the coral reef through the lagoon to the beach until mortally wounded, his third wound, Emmett F. Kirby received the Navy Cross posthumously. Tank support was sought by Regimental Landing Team 25, RLT 25, shortly after noon. Heavy seas drove the coxswains to maneuver their 50-foot landing craft against the reef fringe, stalling the landing. However, LCMs with Company A's M4A2 Shermans replied. The 30-ton steel monsters were told to dive into the shallow water off Blue Beach 2 by the LCMs dropping their bow ramps. Two of the tanks flooded out very immediately after the salt water cut off their electrical systems. Lieutenant Gerald M. "We hit a shell hole, and water came bubbling in," remembered Max English in a tank called King Kong. When it struck the batteries, chlorine gas began to develop. Our hatches had to open. Seawater was entering, but we needed a mechanism to expel that gas. We were unable to breathe. The slow-moving armored vehicles were surrounded by a curtain of artillery and mortar fire as Company A's M4s advanced toward the shore. Unlike the Amtraks transporting troops, none of the tanks were directly damaged by the shell geysers that burst near aboard. The reef was littered with several flaming hulks. Company A went across to support Battalion Landing Team 125, BLT 125, on Aging Point as soon as they landed. Following the Roy Namur campaign, the two units received training in tank infantry tactics, which included holding a school for infantry officers to instruct them on the tactical applications, capabilities, and limitations of tanks. A makeshift tank infantry telephone had also been mounted on the back of each tank by the tank battalion. The troops trusted the tank far more than the artillery as a supporting weapon, since the latter could occasionally fire on their own positions. Ken Estes wrote in Marines Under Armour, the Marine Corps, and the Armored Fighting Vehicle, 1916-2000. There was never such a friendly fire issue with the tanks. When the advancing forces were hit by enfilade fire from a tangle of weapon positions and the wooded area next to the promontory, which caused numerous fatalities and hindered the survivors from continuing, the infantry assault on Aging Point stalled out. The 1st Battalion, 25th, continued to receive withering enfilade fire from Aging Point, the 4th Marine Division wrote during World War II. On the beaches, the adversary was working hard to crush the invasion. Sergeant David Dempsey, a combat correspondent, was assisting with the injured. The desire to relieve himself was expressed by a private first-class stretcher case. He was given the helmet of a nearby sergeant, who was also killed, by a corpsman. As his helmet endured its final humiliation, the sergeant lay there and watched in terrified interest. He moaned, "I hope I live to see the day when a PFC does that in my helmet." One of the 14 Shermans belonging to Company B sank as it was leaving the LSD as the LCMs carrying them shoved off from the LSDs and headed for the shore. The crew was saved and re-embarked on the LSD. As it happened, a Japanese shell struck the same craft directly, killing 4 and wounded 5, including the platoon commander, after another M4's deep-water fording gear was broken in an unanticipated change of weight in the LCM. Heavy artillery bombardment forced the remaining 3 tanks to land on Blue Beach 1 after 3 tanks managed to reach shore. One of these lumbered into a big reef depression and drowned out. 1,000 yards from the intended landing beach, on Green Beach 2, a beach belonging to the 2nd Marine Division, 6 of Company B's tanks were directed to land. Despite his protests, the tank platoon commander was overruled and they entered. In 2 columns, each escorted by a guide, one of whom was killed by shellfire. They landed on the reef and moved shoreward. They came upon really deep water in the middle of the lagoon, roughly halfway to the beach, and 5 tanks were abandoned and totally buried. Only one of the 6 reached the shore, but it was shanghaied by the 2nd Tank Battalion right once, and it took several days for it to return to the 4th Marine Division. For all intents and purposes, the 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marine Regiment, could only be supported by 4 of the initial 14 tanks of Company B. Just off Yellow Beach 2, Company C's 14 tanks waited for the call to land. Major Neiman had trouble getting authorization when the call arrived. I went aboard the control boat and talked the control officer into letting us go, he explained, after nearly 2 hours of waiting. A landing craft carrying 6 UDT guys sailed off the beach as we were circling in our landing craft. He hauled the boat over to my ship after I called out to them, and I hopped into his. I inquired if he knew of a good location where we could be certain there were no mines or underwater impediments. At that moment, a large explosion occurs inland, close to the beach. "See all that smoke?" he asks. So, that's what we did. Go for that, and you won't have any trouble at all. The LCMs grounded on the reef 800 yards from the beach shortly after midday, unloaded Company A's tanks in roughly 5.5 feet of water, and then moved in a column of platoons toward the beach. Neiman clarified, the Japanese had constructed a long pier from the sugar mill at Charinkanoa out to the edge of the reef where we were intended to land. The veteran officer was dubious, but someone at division headquarters concluded that it would be a perfect spot for the tanks to land, and they could run straight up that concrete ramp. We assumed that the Japanese would undoubtedly have their heavy guns focused on the entire canal, particularly that slope. Indeed, amphibious tanks were the first vehicles to do it, and they were destroyed. They, Japanese, waited until we got on the beach, Lieutenant English recalled. Before we reached the shore, they were hurling harassing fire on the reef, but nothing substantial. We moved inland, but many amphibious tanks were held down quite near the waterline. Neiman led his unit to an assembly place and was told to go 1,200 yards inland to the O1 phase line. On a road that ran from Blue Beach 1 to Weslito Airport, he used his right flank to spread the unit out in a frontal assault. The tanks off the road were eventually bogged down and abandoned under fire after a certain distance. Neiman ordered the rest of the company to continue traveling until they had outpaced the infantry that was providing support. Instead of allowing the Japanese soldiers to plant magnetic mines on his tanks, he withdrew at that time. An enemy soldier was able to place magnetic mines over the engine compartments of 3 of Neiman's tanks, causing damage. Without Neiman's vision, there most likely would have been more tank casualties. We attached little pieces of reinforcing steel bar to the tank's sides before we traveled to Saipan. After that, we nailed a 1x3 to the bottom and fastened wooden 2x12s to the sides. We poured concrete in using our flawless concrete form. A bullet would need to strike and pass through 2 inches of reinforced concrete and 2 inches of timber before it could even reach the armor plate. We completed it for every tank. We reasoned that the additional protection would be more beneficial to us than the slight increase in weight. 10 of Company D's flame-throwing light tanks had touched down by 6 p.m. They were told to wait for the night in an assembly area 150 yards inland of Blue Beach 2. Due to a lack of LCMs to land them, 3 tanks from the 3rd platoon were detained aboard the LSD. Since the waterway they intended to utilize was heavily shelled, the whole 1st platoon spent the night in the LCMs. Usually assigned to Company A, the Satan flame tanks were kept in reserve until they were needed for a mission, which was usually against Japanese defenders in caves. Medium tanks would protect them during the mission, and they would return to their assembly location after it was over. The maximum penetration of the beachhead by nightfall was just 1,300 yards inland. The beachhead was bombarded by heavy artillery fire, especially from Oggingen Point. The greatest losses were suffered by the 5th Battalion, 14th Marines. According to Lieutenant Colonel Douglas E. Reeve, the battalion commander, 1 gun in Charlie Battery, 2 guns in Able Battery, and all of Baker Battery's weapons had been knocked out. Trails blown off, sights blown off, recoil mechanism broken, etc. are all examples of what I mean when I say knocked out. Despite the high cost of soldiers and equipment on D-Day, the majority of the 4th Tank Battalion's armor was retrieved, restored, and put back into service, with the exception of 3 tanks that were left in the water and are now used as a war memorial. The Emperor sent a word of encouragement to the Japanese garrison on June 16th. Lieutenant General Saito expressed gratitude for the boundless magnanimity of the imperial favor, which we hope to requite, revenge, by becoming the bulwark of the Pacific with 1,000 deaths after studying it. Without delay, Saito planned an assault against the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, 2nd Marine Division, and, to a lesser degree, 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines. The 1st Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force, 1,000 men from the 136th Infantry Regiment, and 4 companies, 36 B-44 tanks, the greatest Japanese tank attack of the Pacific War, made up the Japanese force. Captain Claude G. Rawlin of Company B, 6th Marines, reported hearing enemy tanks and personnel approaching his position at 3:30 a.m. on the 17th. He instantly called for light and naval fire. Major James A. Donovan, Jr., executive officer of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, stated that all prepared concentrations, including 75mm pack howitzer, 81mm mortar, and the company's own weapons, were called down in front of the forward companies. The first wave of tanks entered Company B's sector at 0345, General Holland Smith stated, citing a Japanese officer who waved his sword in the manner of a cavalryman charging, while a bugler sounded the call, standing in the turret of the lead vehicle. Their rattle and squeak could be distinguished above the shell fire and long bursts of machine gun fire, Donovan continued. The conflict turned into a frenzied flurry of lights, tracers, and cacophony. Other tanks were silhouetted emerging from the fading shadows to the front, or already on top of the squads as the tanks were struck and set on fire. The crew chief was directing from the top of his open turret, and many of the tanks were unbuttoned, turrets open, Donovan stated. Some were being led on foot by a member of the team. They appeared to arrive in 2 waves, either gathered around the turret, gripping the handrail, or transporting foot soldiers on the lengthy engine compartment. The opposing crewmen would halt, jump out of their tank, sing songs, and wave swords, according to one Marine. If they hadn't already been struck, one of them would finally blow a bugle and leap back into the tank. After that, we would use a bazooka to let them have it. A second wave of tanks was followed by swarms of Japanese troops. Tanks from the 2nd Tank Battalion, riflemen, a 2-gun 37mm section, bazooka teams, and Marine heavy machine guns fired at the German tanks. High explosive 75mm rounds were used by the Marine tankers to destroy the lightly armored Japanese armored vehicles, after they soon discovered that their armor-piercing shells were destroying them without exploding. According to Donovan, the Japanese tanks seemed perplexed. What little control they had was lost when Marine rifle and machine gun fire struck their guides and crew chiefs. They continued to walk in the general direction of the beach, getting struck repeatedly until they all burned or spun in circles without purpose before stopping. One Marine accounted for 4 hits on 4 different tanks with his rocket launcher, and then, after running out of rockets, climbed upon a 5th tank and, with utter disregard for his own personal safety, dropped an incendiary grenade in the turret, disabling the tank, according to his Navy Cross citation. By 4:20 a.m., the main Japanese tank infantry offensive had been destroyed, but for several more hours, snipers and dispersed survivors fought on. The Regimental Special Weapons Company's 75mm half-tracks completed the remaining and crippled tanks around dawn. The counterattack was a complete failure. The enemy lost hundreds of irreplaceable soldiers, including the tank regiment commander, and between 24 and 31 tanks. "I don't think we have to fear Jap tanks anymore on Saipan," declared Brig. Ginger T.E. Watson. "We have their phone number." According to Major Donovan, just before dawn, the U.S. the 27th Infantry Division of the Army touched down. They were the first National Guard division to participate in the Pacific War, having been called to service in 1940 and consisting of many New York-based National Guard units. Even with the battle the day before, they had a difficult journey ahead of them. The scenery was one of complete battle, even if the beaches were no longer an immediate threat. The beach was littered with boxes of sea rations and disabled LVTs. The bodies of unrecovered dead Marines floated in the water. A fine gray dust covered the leaves of shattered trees and underbrush. The Japanese gradually retreated, by night, to the prepared bunkers and natural caves in the interior of the island, burying their dead as they went and dragging their equipment with them, combat journalist Gilbert Bailey recounted. The crap hit the fan on June 24th. After losing faith in Ralph Smith's lack of aggressive spirit, Holland Smith received a message from Vice ADM Raymond A. Spruance, Commander, 5th Fleet, and Smith's superior. You are authorized and directed to relieve Major General Ralph Smith from command of the 27th Division, U.S. Army, and place Maji. General Sandiford Jarman in command of this division. I told Spruance on board the Indianapolis that the situation demanded a change in command, writes Holland Smith in Coral and Brass. What should I do? He inquired. Ralph Smith has demonstrated a lack of aggression, and his division is impeding our progress. Ralph Smith should be relieved. Relieving him was one of the most unpleasant things I have ever had to do. Nevertheless, there are instances in combat where a commander's duty to his nation and his soldiers calls for drastic actions. Smith's division was not fighting as it should, and its failure to perform was threatening American lives. There was a lot of hostility between the Army and Marines as a result of Ralph Smith's relief, which swiftly turned into an inter-service dispute. Smith pleaded with Lieutenant General Robert C. Richardson, the U.S. No Army combat troops should ever again be permitted to serve under the command of Marine Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith, according to the Army forces in the Pacific Ocean areas. Richardson was so incensed that he established a board of investigation to look into the relief's facts. The Army Board decided that General Ralph Smith's relief was not justified by the facts, which is hardly surprising. Major General George W. Greiner, who took command of the 27th after the relief, thought that Holland Smith is so prejudiced against the Army that no Army division serving under his command alongside of Marine divisions can expect that their deeds will receive fair and honest evaluation. The battle's advancement was not significantly impacted by the change of command. Over the following 2 weeks, the Japanese resisted as the Americans gradually pushed them back. However, the defenders' primary goal was to eliminate as many of the enemy as they could before they perished, because supplies were running low and reinforcements were not an option. A final Gyokusai attack, breaking of the jewels, referred to by the Marines as a banzai strike, was authorized by General Saito on July 4th after he realized the battle was lost. Captured intelligence officer Major Hoshida Hiyoshi of the 43rd Division clarified, they realized right away that they had little chance of success. They merely believed that dying in this manner and taking some of the enemy with them was preferable to being slain when holed up in tunnels. Saito told his officers, I will advance with those who remain to deliver still another blow to the American devils, and leave my bones on Saipan as a bulwark of the Pacific. Saito held a final conference with his remaining commanders and decided to launch an attack on the evening of 6th to 7th of July against the Army's 27th Division, where a 300-yard gap existed between the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 106th Infantry. To warn the dispersed units of the impending invasion, messengers were dispatched. In an attempt to bring the disparate groups and personnel together tactically, numerous makeshift units were established. Up to 3,000 soldiers and citizens were thought to be involved, some of whom lacked guns and equipment, and were only equipped with hand grenades and rudimentary bamboo spears. Saito said, there is no longer any distinction between civilians and troops, referring to the large number of civilians who were still on Japanese soil. It would be preferable if they used bamboo spears to join the assault. General Smith went to the command post of the 27th Division on the afternoon of July 6th and warned Greiner, the newly appointed division commander, that a banzai attack probably would come down, late that night or early the next morning. I advised him to ensure that his battalions were physically restrained. I departed his command position, feeling that I had fulfilled every duty a general could have. The march was ordered by Saito. I moved forward to find the adversary, but, as one staff officer put it, the exhausted general, feeling that he was too aged and infirm, he had been wounded earlier by shrapnel, to be of use in the counterattack, held a farewell feast of sake and canned crab meat, and then committed suicide in the early hours of the 7th. According to one story, when the general made a ceremonial cut in Saito's stomach, Saito had his adjutant shoot him in the head. Then, to prevent his body from ending up in American hands, it was torched. The majority of the assailants began moving south between the shore and the cliffs that bordered the Tanapag Plain at around 4 in the morning. When patrols from the 27th Division noticed the big group of Japanese forces approaching, they reported the disturbance to the naval gunfire and undetected artillery. According to 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry 1st Sergeant Mario Auccionario, we started to hear this buzz. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard, and it continued to grow louder. Up to 3,000 Japanese soldiers, including those who were injured or disabled, took part in the assault along the railroad track. At 4:45, the blow struck the space between the 105th Infantry's 1st and 2nd Battalions. Once the enemy had gotten through the opening, the Americans were struck from the flank and then the back. The two battalions were cut off from one another very immediately after the onslaught began, and the troops were left to battle for their lives. It reminded me of those old cattle stampede scenes in the movies, said Major Edward McCarthy, commanding 2nd Battalion, in reference to the assault. With the camera in a hole in the ground, you can observe the herd approaching before they jump over you and disappear. The Japanese were the only ones who continued to arrive. I didn't believe they would ever cease. J.G. Lieutenant C.J. According to an eyewitness report by Blanc, Naval Gunnery Liaison Officer with the 1st Battalion, 105th Infantry, he heard firing on the perimeter at 0450. On both sides of the railroad, a Japanese force that was so large that it was impossible to estimate its size was seen racing down. Along with service weapons, the adversary had clubs and knives. They were crowding so closely together that our troops scarcely needed to aim, dashing and shouting wildly. While others engaged the two battalions in large numbers, the enemy on the cliffside of the tunnel kept flowing southwest. Lieutenant Blanc and 7 men worked their way southwest, following a route between the railroad and the coast until they were able to enter friendly lines. By 10:30, the two battalions had been completely destroyed by heavy mortar fire, and fighting had devolved into a hand-to-hand, individual, every man for himself conflict. The full thrust of the offensive reached the front lines of the 27th Division just before 5 a.m. The American 1st Battalion's fortifications were overrun in less than 30 minutes of intense close combat, while the 3rd Battalion, which was on high ground, managed to hold. The 3rd Battalion, 10th Marines, an artillery battalion 600 yards behind the Army lines, was in the path of the Japanese due to their momentum. 1st Lieutenant Arnold C. Hofstetter, Battery H. 310, recalled. Around 0300, small arms and machine gun fire was heard to the front and right front, and it appeared to get closer. To obtain a close ricochet, the gunners were instructed to trim time fuses to 410 seconds. The rest of the firing battery had to retreat around 150 yards and form a perimeter as the Japanese pushed through a forested ravine and began firing cannoneers from their locations. We waited until approximately 1,500 hours, at which point we were relieved by Army soldiers. After using up all of its small arms ammo, Battery I was forced to retreat as the Japanese kept moving forward along the train track. They were 500, 600 yards closer to the 105th Infantry Command Post at 5:30 a.m. The 105th Infantry's 1st and 2nd Battalions were separated. Some troops, having exhausted their ammunition, swam out to the reef and were picked up by the small boats of a destroyer, the 27th Infantry Division's report of operations wrote. In a last-ditch effort that lasted for several hours, the U.S., the Japanese survivors were ultimately forced to leave by the soldiers. In other areas, a mixed force of Marines and troops came together to massacre the assailants. The beaten survivors withdrew back to their starting position in small, haphazard groups. During the day, the actual extent of the enemy assault became apparent. Japanese corpses were scattered around the battlefield. Over 4,000 Japanese people were thought to have died in the Great Banzai attack. They also lost more than 400 Americans. 2 more days were spent on mop-up efforts, but the Japanese had lost the battle. Mopping up efforts were finished, and organized Japanese resistance had stopped by July 9th. General Smith proclaimed the island secure at 4:15 p.m. on July 19th. However, there was no satisfaction or joy in winning. It is estimated that 10,437 Marine Corps and 3,674 Army personnel were killed, wounded, or reported missing in action out of the 71,000 soldiers that comprised Holland Smith's Northern Troops and Landing Force. About 20% of the combat forces who were committed are represented by this 14,111 total. Only 921 of the 3,000 Japanese soldiers in the garrison were taken prisoner. The others perished. Instead of surrendering, the Japanese leaders Saito and Vice Adm. Nagumo, along with some 5,000 people, chose to terminate their own lives. Unfortunately, the atrocities continued, despite the widespread carnage between the fighters. Between 25,000 and 3,000 Japanese residents lived on the island, and Tokyo warned them that the American takeover would result in violence, rape, and torture. Some islanders pushed their children off steep cliffs and then jumped themselves, while others clung around exploding hand grenades to avoid what they believed to be their certain doom. Before American interpreters could persuade the people that they would be treated fairly, thousands of them killed themselves. On Japan, the suicides on Saipan received a lot of attention and recognition. The women who chose to leap off the cliffs with their children were hailed as the pride of Japanese women by a Japanese correspondent. Authors note, I stood on the 300-foot suicide cliff on a tourist trip to Saipan, where hundreds of civilian men, women, and children were thrown or jumped to their deaths, and I couldn't imagine what made them do it. Reading about the tragedy is one thing, but looking down at the ragged rocks below is just too difficult to comprehend.